Welcome to Prevention is Now. I'm Deb Bonner, preventionist and community advocate for Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault in Springfield, Illinois. In January of this year, Franchon Stapleton of Springfield, Illinois, was sentenced to 4 life sentences for 4 counts each of sex trafficking, plus 65 additional years, 5 years for each of the 13 related charges. Stapleton pled guilty to all of the charges he was facing as a result of a sex trafficking scheme he ran in 2017 and 2018, during which he recruited victims from Champaign, Peoria, and Sangamon counties. At his sentencing, the U.S. District Judge presiding over the case stated anything less than life would ignore the nature of the offense, the impact to the victims, the defendant's lack of remorse, and his prior criminal history, as well as the sentencing guidelines. Now, while this story is horrific, it is also sadly not unique. Human trafficking is the second largest crime in the world, second only to illegal drugs, with profits in 2014 estimated at $99 billion. That's billion dollars. A study from the United Nations International Labor Organization estimated 3.8 million adults and 1 million children were victims of forced sexual exploitation in 2016 around the world. It is a serious problem in this country as well, with current statistics suggesting that 85% of human trafficking victims in this country are, in fact, U.S. citizens. So what do we do about it? Awareness of the issue is only a small part of the solution. There needs to be an understanding of who is most at risk and why, so appropriate interventions can happen before victimization. What social norms allow for trafficking to continue or that prevent survivors from speaking up? What agencies need to come together to help create safer communities and decrease the opportunity for this kind of exploitation, just to name a few of the prevention issues at hand. To talk more about the issue of sex trafficking and its impact is Dr. Chitra Raghavan. Dr. Raghavan is a tenured professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, the director of the Forensic Mental Health Counseling Program, and the coordinator for the Victimology Studies in Forensic Psychology. She is also a clinical psychologist in New York City, specializing in assessment of sex trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual violence. She has published numerous articles, including 2015's Trauma-coerced Bonding in Victims of Sex Trafficking, Where Do We Go From Here? International Journal of Emergency Mental Health and Human Resilience. And in 2014, Dr. Raghavan was named as one of New York's new abolitionists by the New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition. Dr. Raghavan, thanks for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here. And the one thing that you didn't say is I did my doctorate at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. So I'm so happy to reconnect in some way to Springfield and Illinois.
Now, I think the term human trafficking can be a little misleading for some people because it creates this image that people have to be transported across state lines or international borders. But, in the case I was speaking of that was involving the Springfield man, everything was right here in the state of Illinois. So can you talk a little bit about what sex trafficking actually is and really how common it really is?
This is a very good question, Deb. The term trafficking is really a legal term, and that's why it causes so much confusion in people, because the term doesn't actually evoke, if you will, what folks experience. And so the best way for us to think about it is sex trafficking happens when someone, typically a woman or a minor or LGBTQ population, is in some way deceived, manipulated, cheated, or pressured into selling sex for money or other kinds of things. And so the crucial idea here is not so much that you're dragged across the border, but you're in some way seduced, deceived, exploited, and manipulated into doing something that you either didn't think you were going to do, or what happens quite often is you agree to sell sex for money, but you think you can leave when you want, or the conditions are described to you in a way that's actually what it ends up not being. So a great deal of what's happening around sex trafficking is lying and deceit and manipulation, often with threats of force.
You see in the media, the idea of a prostitute and her quote-unquote pimp, and the power that person has over her. I mean, that would be an actual example, a common everyday example of sex trafficking, correct?
In most cases, yes. So most typically, not always, but in the majority of cases, the pimp has power in a way that's very coercive, and she is not able to negotiate with him without danger.
And now, a significant part of primary prevention is identifying those people or populations who are at the biggest risk. In sex trafficking, we know women, children, those who identify along the LGBTQIA plus spectrum are at highest risk. But what other factors put people at risk, and what can we do to mitigate some of this?
So at the highest level, there's sort of three big factors. And one is, do you have a safe place to stay or go or live in? And which, if you don't, that leads to homelessness. Now, homelessness can come from domestic violence situation. Homelessness can come from being thrown out of your family home because you're gay or queer in some way, or because there's abuse in your home, you're in foster care, or you're on the street, right? So there's all these different factors leading to homelessness. And so one way to identify folks is who is at risk for homelessness. And again, these are, if you're a little bit older, it's because of domestic violence with a partner. If you're younger, it's violence in the family, or your family throwing you out because you're gay, or being in foster care and aging out. Related to the idea of disruption and chaos in the family is whether or not you are using drugs. And so many younger folk, but also older folk, and by older I mean in their 20s, are recruited because they have a drug addiction. But drug addiction rarely happens unless there's also some sort of trauma that happened before that. So again, we're looking at a context of chaos. So I think looking at families of origin where there's chaos, as well as domestic violence and homelessness, can help us spot early on what puts people at risk.
Another area we look at in prevention are what are the social norms that need to be changed to help eliminate problematic behavior. Socialized gender roles and how control is enacted is something that I know you've spoken of before. So how do current norms exacerbate the risks of sex trafficking, and what do we do to correct those issues?
Okay. This is a really, really important question, Deb. And I think there's sort of different ways to address the idea of social norms, but I'll start with something that we're really not doing. There's a lot of silence in society over buying of sex. We sort of pretend that it doesn't happen. We pretend that it happens to others or that it's not widespread. But some of the surveys indicate that up to 30% of men have at some point in their life visited someone who identifies as a prostitute or was being commercially sexually exploited. If you think about that, it means if you're in a room, 1 out of 3 men probably is paid for sex, right? So we're hypocrites when it comes to this. And I think the first social norm we should change is the silence over buying sex. Men have to stand up against other men, or at least stand up and be critical of it. This norm of silence, I think, is really harming those who are trafficked. And once people talk about it more openly and express that they don't find this acceptable, I think there's going to be, first of all, there's going to be places to talk about it, and women will be more likely to say, hey, but I was exploited. But right now, I think there really is such a norm of silence.
I think one of the other things is I've seen as I was doing my research, how many times people refer to prostitution as a quote unquote victimless crime. And like there's just not an understanding that so many times that, well, women want to do this. It is a choice to be a prostitute. And we know, looking at the numbers, that very rarely is that the case.
That's exactly right. And I think, it's really a travesty to call it a victimless crime. And I think one of the first things that we have to change in the norms is for people to understand what does it mean to be freely consenting and enjoying sex? And what does it mean to having no choice because there's a power imbalance? And for that, folks have to learn what consent is. They have to learn how consent is coerced, how consent is forced, how consent, sometimes people don't have the choice, so they're not consenting. So we really don't have a very mature or nuanced understanding of consent. We have a very simple one, really. Either you say yes or you say no. But the reality is you slowly start to say yes because someone has lit a fire and that fire is harming you. And you're trying not to get burned, really. So I definitely agree. I think folks have to really understand what does it mean to be powerless in a nuanced way.
We are speaking with Dr. Chitra Raghavan, professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, among many other things. Now, encounters with the justice system can be very re-traumatizing for victims of trafficking. They run the risk of facing criminal charges. Trauma bonding may prevent them from disclosing the reality of their situation, or maybe they might even be unwilling to testify against their abuser. What corrections need to take place in policy and procedure within the legal system to help with prevention efforts?
I think the first thing we need to realize is particularly in the pimp-based model, that women do not consider necessarily the pimp as just a pimp, it's also the boyfriend. So we're asking women who've been in relationships with men whom they consider to be a boyfriend, however difficult or uncomfortable that might seem for the viewer. So we're asking these women to testify against their boyfriends or their husbands or the father of their children. So this is very similar to domestic violence. I think the first thing we need to be is to be sensitive, that when you ask someone to testify against someone they've been connected with emotionally, you're asking them essentially to break their affection and to break their loyalty. And that takes time. That takes recognition of abuse, recognition of victimization, and then stepping back and healing from those wounds. And also, the person who's cooperating with the justice system needs to have sort of inner strength to hold herself or himself when they testify against someone who they once considered to be an important lover. And that's sort of the difficult sentimental part. And then there's, of course, also fear of stigma, fear of publicity, fear of being labeled forever a prostitute, not wanting to be public about it, all these things that bring shame and fear and publicity. And finally, I think the justice system has to be patient that women don't trust them. And they don't trust them for some very obvious reasons. If you've been arrested 20 times for working on the street, you're obviously not going to trust the police and now say, actually, we want to help you. We also know, unfortunately, that despite the best efforts of law enforcement, there's frequently remarks that are made that are degrading by the police officer or arresting law enforcement officer, jokes made, or being arrested while they're in states of undress and then not being allowed to get dressed and being dragged out onto the street half naked. Now, all these sorts of very difficult encounters that really, I think, need to be cleaned up. And so if women don't want to collaborate, it's because they've had a lifetime of difficulties on both ends with the pimp, but also with the criminal justice system.
How much does fear play in that if my abuser is arrested, now all of a sudden I'm on the street? I may not like my situation right now. I may be hurt. I may be exploited, but I have food to eat. I have a roof over my head. And if he goes away, so does all of that. How does that fear play into this scenario?
I think the fear of not being able to make it is huge and realistic. For some women, there is really no other option at the very moment. And, we need to offer that option. If you're going to arrest the source of income, then you need to provide a viable source of income that isn't humiliating, that's dignified, and that doesn't make the women feel like, well, do I want to be humiliated this way or do I want to be humiliated this other way? And I think that is part of the problem. There's also the fear that women often have that they cannot make it because they've been told that over and over again. And they may not have the social networks to hear a different story. So we also have to be sensitive to trauma.
We've talked a lot about sex trafficking as it relates to prostitution, but that's not the only industry that benefits from trafficking. There has been some evidence to suggest that the porn industry is also very closely tied to sex trafficking. In her paper, Human Trafficking and Pornography, Using the Trafficking Victims Protection Act to Prosecute Trafficking for the Production of Internet Pornography, which was a very long title, author Alison Luswick stated, evidence shows that pornography increases demand for sex trafficking. Can you expand on what this link is?
So in the last 40, 50 years, and there's several studies and documentaries on the topic, pornography has moved from sort of the vantage point of sexual liberation to degrading women. Over time, we're getting more and more pornography that degrades women in particularly awful ways. And so when we use the term pornography, I think some of us still think about pornography as liberating women, and that is no longer quite as true as it was in the 70s. Right? That's the first, I think, maybe important point. And so what does porn today benefit from? Or what does porn today show? It presents women as objects who like being degraded, who enjoy violence, who beg for it, and who express satisfaction on screen when they're treated like garbage. So we give the message to very young men, teenage boys really, that this is what sex is, and this is what women like, and this is what you should do, and this is accessible. And over time, what this really means is most women will say, no, I don't want to be treated like garbage, and no, I don't want to perform these acts, and no, I don't have this kind of body. I mean, no woman really has this kind of body. It's a manufactured body often. And so it's both suggesting to men, well, then if this is what I've seen a lot and what I want, then I should purchase it. And when I purchase it, I can do it guilt-free. Why can I do it guilt-free? One, women want it because, that's what they're saying on TV. They're saying, I love this, do more of this for me. Two, when I purchase sex from a woman, she's always looking so happy and cheerful and delighted, and, so why would I disbelieve her, right? So I think these things are linked. The forced presentation of women as if they're enjoying it and as if they really want it allows men to continue, buying sex guilt-free, feeling like they're actually, contributing to something women want, and it's victimless and everybody's happy. So I think porn continues this illusion that sex work is glamorous and beautiful and, women love it. And this is, I think, the great, great disservice that the movie Pretty Women has done to women.
Now, sex trafficking is a very complicated issue that still remains fairly hidden to the average person. The U.S. Department of State recommends one of the key elements in preventing sex trafficking is going out and increasing data collection and research. So what data should we be collecting and who should be collecting it?
Okay. So the data that we should be collecting really is much more sophisticated data on coercion, fraud, and force. In other words, coercive control. And we need to get this at a really... we need to understand that power is in flux and that consensual entry into commercial sex is not the same as consenting to stay in it. So women consent, often thinking they understand the deal, and then they try to leave, but they can't leave because they're told that they owe money, or they've become drug addicted, or the addiction's gotten worse, or they're in some way dependent on the pimp or have a relationship with him. So I think, the most important thing that we have to do is to systematically identify, has there been coercion, and when did it happen? At the beginning, in the middle, towards the end? Because what we're doing right now is we're not identifying coercion, or we're doing it in a very simplistic manner. Did he force you? Were you dragged in? But then we're also not asking, importantly, what happened in the middle? Did you try to leave? Was it impossible? Did you know it was even pointless to negotiate with him because at this point you were aware of how violent he was? Or did you believe you owed so much money that you couldn't get out, right? So I think we need good data on coercion and at different points of the relationship. To get data like that, you need really well-trained researchers who, it's a difficult question. For your data to be nuanced, either the assessment questions have to be nuanced or the data needs to be qualitative, so interview style. And I think, at least in all my research, we listen to the women who were trafficked and we modify our questions based on that. So there has to be some degree of participation, I think, from survivors.
Now, there has been a growing trend of survivors suing hotel and motel operators because they say that these people are in a unique position to be able to spot the red flags that may indicate trafficking. Now, legally, they're relying on the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which allows civil suits against anyone who, quote, knowingly benefits financially or by receiving anything of value from participating in a trafficking venture if they knew or should have known that the venture violated the law. However, from a prevention standpoint, do you think those in the hospitality industry should be more proactive in prevention efforts? And if so, what do they need to know?
I do think that those in the hospitality industry need to be much more proactive. A very important thing that folks, not only in the hospitality industry, but not only in the hospitality industry, need to understand is what is consent and what does it look like? And by that I mean, when you see a woman walk into a hotel who's dressed what might seem to, the folks working as sexy and glamorous, it doesn't mean her life is sexy or glamorous. When she walks in smiling and laughing, it doesn't mean she's happy to be there. When she looks, she's playing a role, and that role is often as a result of fear, coercion, despair, or survival. So to really understand that the appearance of consent and glamour and sex is not actually true. And I think if they understand that, they might be able to better sympathize and empathize with what's really going on. It might also, lead to less blaming of the victim and less viewing these women as manipulative or being okay with prostitution or exploitation, and then at a later date saying, well, actually, we weren't okay with it, right? So I think educating hospitality industry to the nuances, which I think will also help address some of the prejudice that a lot of folks have against women in commercial sexual exploitation, which is to say they really want to do this. Now they're sort of turning around and crying that they don't, this is manipulative. So I think really educating them on consent.
So I think I already know what your answer is going to be to this next question. But as we start to wrap things up, what would you say is going to be the biggest challenge in addressing and preventing sex trafficking over, say, the next 5 years or so?
Okay. So I think there's two things, and you probably guessed both of them. And the first is getting men to speak up and addressing how damaging sex trafficking and prostitution is to women, and speaking up against other men and speaking up boldly and freely, even though it makes them uncomfortable and it makes them nervous. And men really need to do this. And the second is, I think men might be more likely to do this, and women might also be more likely to pressure men to do this if they have a better understanding of consent. Right now, our understanding of consent is so black and white and so simplistic that we fail to understand how women are trapped in these situations. So I think if we can do those two things, we're going to be much closer to prevention.
Dr. Raghavan, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
This has been Prevention is Now. I'm Deb Bonner, preventionist and community advocate for Perry Center Against Sexual Assault. If you would like more information or have questions about this program, you may call our offices at 217-744-2560 or send me an email at dbonner@prairiecasa.org. Perry Center Against Sexual Assault supports children and adult survivors of sexual violence through counseling and legal and medical advocacy in 11 central Illinois counties. Perry Center offers coaching boys into men for male high school and college athletes, bringing in the bystander training for college campuses and sexual harassment prevention training for businesses and organizations in our area. Our main office is located in Springfield, Illinois, with satellite offices in Jacksonville and Taylorville, Illinois. And you can find out more about our services at our website at prairiecasa.org. This program is supported by a grant from the Illinois Department of Public Health and the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Points of views or opinions contained in this program are those of Perry Center Against Sexual Assault and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the official positions or policies of these grantors. Thank you for listening.